When we hear the year 1492, the word that usually jumps to mind is discovery, right? But what if that's not the whole story? What if we look at it from a totally different angle? Let's reframe it. This wasn't a discovery, it was a collision, a really profound world-altering impact between two realities that, until that moment, had no idea the other even existed.
So what does happen when two worlds meet for the first time? This story goes way beyond just two groups of people shaking hands. It's really about perception, about massive misunderstandings, and a fundamental clash between two completely different ways of seeing, well, everything. Okay, so let's set the scene. We're going back to October 1492, to the shores of an island its people called Guanahani. Today we know it as part of the Bahamas. For the Taino people living there, this day probably started like any other. But trust me, it was going to end with something arriving that was totally beyond anything they could have ever imagined.
I want you to just try and imagine what this was like from the shore. You're looking out at the water, and you don't see ships, not like any you've ever known. You see these towering wooden structures that seem to move with this weird, unnatural purpose, nothing like the familiar rhythm of a canoe. So yeah, the Taino came closer, but they were cautious. Their traditions demanded hospitality, but something in their gut must have been telling them that these visitors, and whatever they wanted, were a complete mystery.
And right away, we get this huge contrast. Let's flip the script and look at it from Christopher Columbus's point of view, straight from his journal. The Taino are seeing this strange, imposing sight. And what does Columbus see? He sees resources. His first impression isn't just curiosity, nope. It's an assessment. He's already measuring, calculating. This initial disconnect is absolutely crucial to understanding everything that follows. You have the Taino, who are following their customs to a T. They're offering gifts, trying to build a relationship to bring these strangers into their community. And Columbus and his crew? Well, they accept the gifts, sure, but their eyes have this quiet hunger. They're taking what's offered, but they are looking for something completely different. And that interaction pretty much immediately opened up this huge chasm of misunderstanding. It really all boiled down to one thing, the difference between gifts and gold. So to really get the Taino perspective, you have to wrap your head around their gift economy. For them, giving something wasn't a transaction, like buying something at a store. No way. It was the lifeblood of their entire community. It was how you created bonds, how you showed mutual respect, and how you created obligations to each other. A gift wasn't the end of a deal. It was the start of a relationship. It was all about social harmony. But Columbus? He looked at this and saw something totally different. He didn't see a sophisticated social custom. He just saw naivete. He wrote that they would give anything for basically nothing. He thought they were simple, that they'd be easy to take advantage of. He just completely missed the entire point of what they were doing.
Now, from the Taino point of view, this obsession the newcomers had with gold, this shiny yellow metal that for them was just for simple ornaments, it must have seemed so bizarre. Actually, more than bizarre, it was troubling. This kind of intense attachment to an object over actual human relationships, to them, that signaled a deep spiritual imbalance. It was like a kind of sickness.
But this wasn't just a simple cultural misunderstanding. Things were about to get a lot more ominous. The Europeans were about to do something that was just completely incomprehensible to the Taino.
So at one point, the Taino just have to stand there and watch as Columbus performs this bizarre ceremony. He literally plants a flag in their sand and starts speaking words they can't understand, declaring that their home, this island, now belongs to some king who lives thousands of miles across the ocean. Can you even imagine trying to make sense of that?
And if you want to know the mindset behind that whole ceremony, look no further than his own journal. This quote says it all. He might have been smiling and accepting gifts, but in private, his thoughts were all about conquest. He wasn't seeing people to connect with, he was seeing a population he could easily subdue.
Which brings us to a really big question, right? How could you even do that? How could Columbus, or any European for that matter, justify claiming a land that was obviously already someone's home? People lived there. How do you discover a place that's already inhabited? Well, the answer lies in something called the doctrine of discovery. This was a really powerful legal and religious idea back in Europe. And what it said basically was that Christian nations had the right to claim any lands they found that weren't already ruled by Christians. So in their worldview, the fact that people were already living there was just irrelevant.
And this really gets to the heart of the conflict, doesn't it? It's about two totally opposite ideas about what land even is. For the Taino, land was something to be shared and cared for, the thing that gave life to the whole community. But for the Europeans, with their doctrine of discovery, land was property. It was something to be discovered, to be claimed, and to be owned.
So when you start putting all of these pieces together, the clashing ideas about hospitality, about wealth, about the very land under their feet, it becomes so clear. This was never going to be just a friendly meeting. It was an inevitable, totally irreconcilable collision of two worlds.
And you have to remember, the Taino were sharp observers. They saw the signs, They saw how these strangers ignored their most important customs of peace. They saw how they were constantly handling their weapons. They saw those assessing eyes that never stopped watching. And maybe worst of all, they saw how they marked the land as if it was totally empty, as if the Taino themselves weren't even there.
Let's just break this whole collision down to its core. The Taino's motivation? Building a relationship. Columbus's motivation? Acquisition. The Taino's action was generosity, which to them meant building a bond. But how did Columbus interpret that exact same action? As vulnerability. It all comes back to those two polar opposite worldviews, stewardship versus ownership.
And really, that's the main takeaway here. When you try to see this whole event through Taino eyes, a much deeper truth comes out. October 1492 wasn't about the discovery of a new world. It was the start of a massive, profound disruption of a very old one. It was an interruption that would literally change the course of human history forever.
So that leaves us with one last thing to think about. Because these huge, foundational misunderstandings about land, about wealth, about community, they didn't just disappear back in 1492, they set a pattern. So the question for us is, how do the echoes of that very first collision, that clash of worlds, still shape our societies, our laws, and even how we relate to each other right now today?